keynote conversation because the topic relates to science. Would you please welcome to the stage Bill Nye, the science guy.
John, so good to see you.
Good to see you. So that was the appropriate level of applause, I think. There was a really interesting story that relates to you in Intelligence Squared that I want to start with.
Yes.
You have been in the past a member of our audience. You've been out there, and there was one particular debate that you attended, and an interesting thing happened. Pick it up from there.
So I was a debate about genetically modified organisms, GMOs.
The resolution was genetically modified food
is good or bad.
No, it was stated as an imperative. Genetically modify food.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So I had been skeptical of it because we have so much extra food in the world that goes to waste. And when I had come of age and was doing science education on the TV, there was to sequence the genome of a corn plant would take a month or so. And so I felt that you could have so-called knock-on effects. You could do something to the ecosystem of a farm that you didn't mean to do, and this would then make it GMOs just not necessary, and let's not do it, and let's not, Prometheus, let's not mess with the unknown. But I watched the debate, and the key figure for me was Rob Fraley, who was the head of Monsanto. Monsanto! Ah! And he was very compelling, and so he buttonholed me after the debate, and he invited me to St. Louis, to Monsanto in St. Louis. And I went there, and I looked around, and I did more research, and I said genetically modified foods, or genetically modified organisms are really okay. They can sequence, those people, can sequence genes now in about 5 minutes. It's really amazing. So in the 20 years since I did the Science Guy show, I believe I'm justifying it. I believe the technology advanced to the point where they really can get a very good sense of what will happen to ecosystems. And they do just extensive tests. And Monsanto is now Bayer. And did you ever see Young Frankenstein?
Yes.
Frau Brucke. So I decided that they're really not the great evil, and when I was a kid, I came to New York City, the World's Fair was here, and the United Nations had a total board. There were 3 billion people in the world. As of today, there are about 7.6 billion people. They're going to be 9, they're going to be 10, probably 10 billion people, and they're all going to have to eat something. And I think genetically modified crops are going to be a big part of the future. That's what I've concluded.
So but
it started here.
And that's what... Yeah. I will not interrupt an applause line for Intelligence Squared. I almost did. But it would be interesting to hear your experience on the process of changing your mind in the face of a scientific argument being put before you. Tonight we're going to be here scientific arguments. A lot of us are lay people in regard to science. Can you share 2 things? One, I'll ask it in sequence. I'll say the second question, repeat the second question later. But the first one is, in any way, was it difficult for you to let go of a conviction? What's that emotional process like?
And I tell you don't do it immediately. It's not the so-called light bulb. You sit and think about it. And I had the resources to go 2 places. I went to St. Louis and walked around Monsanto. Then I went to Minneapolis to the Monarch venture. So one of the concerns about glyphosate, which you know as Roundup, is that it kills milkweed, which farmers think of as a weed, but a monarch butterfly, I don't know exactly what they think, but I believe they think of it as food. And so one of the concerns was, or a huge concern was, you're killing the monarch butterflies because the glyphosate is killing the milkweed. So they had this meeting of what I would describe the corporate pigs, Monsanto, Frau Brucke, and
it's getting smaller and smaller.
And the hippies, the monarch butterfly loving hippies. And they reached this, I thought, kind of cool agreement. There are now refuges of milkweed on what people call the flyways of monarch butterflies. It's kind of cool.
If you come to a point,
But it took weeks.
well,
It took months.
and if you
That's
come to a
your
point sort of intellectually, emotionally, psychologically, where you're saying, I was wrong, that means I was an idiot.
No, there's
how
other
do you-
reasons I think I'm an idiot.
Okay.
Yeah. There's
but
a lot of evidence. I think people who know me.
The process of letting go of an idea.
Oh, it's you don't do it in a weekend. It takes quite a while. But it was the intelligence squared that changed my mind. So thank you.
And so my other question, the second part of that question, that's it. The other part of the question is, so for a lay audience who won't have the chance to go visit headquarters, et cetera, they're going to have an hour and 15 minutes tonight. How do we listen to these arguments? How do we judge the quality of the arguments that are being made when science comes into it? What should we be listening for?
Well, it's
in general.
I mean, to me, science is a discipline, and it's a habit of mind that is really takes years of messing with it to overcome. You know, we have this expression, confirmation bias, where you have a belief, you see something that confirms it, and you embrace that. You see something that would, if there's a verb, disconfirm it or deny it, and you push that away. So in science, we do our best to be objective. Now, humans are doing it, so there's going to be humans involved, but the idea is to evaluate evidence. The modern word you use is critical, to think critically about evidence. It's a habit of mind that takes a long time. I'm a mechanical engineer, and you know, if the car doesn't stop when the brakes are applied, then there's something wrong with the brakes, people. We got to address this. You can't ignore it. And so tonight, I am doing my best to be agnostic. I want to hear what these people have to say about nuclear power.
What are you going to be listening for?
There's a couple things that everybody wonders about. Is what are we going to do? Let's save that one. But first of all, is it safe, writ large? Is nuclear power safe? And then what are we going to do with nuclear waste? Is there a good place to put nuclear waste? Everybody wants to know that. Do you want it in your neighborhood or the other guy's neighborhood? And then there are extraordinary claims about how much it costs on both sides. Some people say it's very inexpensive. Some people say it's very cheap. And I'd like to hear, I'm very interested in hearing what the two sides have to say about this.
Can we take a little step back? You mentioned you were a mechanical engineer.
Yeah, I'm human, but also...
Yeah. So you're an engineer who is mechanical, or you're an engineer?
It's a great question. Yeah, I'll have to think about it.
I have a card that says you're a scientist, engineer, comedian, author, inventor, education advocate, CEO of the Planetary Society, host of the Science Rules podcast. You starred in the Netflix show Bill Nye Saves the World, but perhaps Bill is best known for his children's science show, Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yes. Woo! Thank you. Yes. So speaking of science and habit of mind, that show was designed for people 10 years old. No, I'm not joking, because we had very compelling research that 10 years old is about as old as you can be to get the so-called lifelong passion for science. And I think it's about as old as you can be to get a lifelong passion for anything. If you know somebody who's a journalist, he or she liked telling stories before they were 7, you know. Like you're a journalist, you probably like stories.
I loved your show when I was a kid.
You're joking me. You're joking me. What are you, 6 months older than I am?
Yeah,
or something?
6 months.
So you're a kid. So that habit of mind, the reason we did that 10 years old was to, dare I say it, change the world. Because I came of age as an engineer when we were creating the Ford Pinto. If you don't know this, this was a vehicle where if you got rear-ended, it would quite commonly catch on fire. And there was some notorious things where people got killed by this thing exploding. And what made it go bad was there were documents at the Ford Motor Company where the legal department had reckoned how much it would cost to pay the lawsuits instead of move the tailpipe away from the gas tank.
Yeah.
And I was embarrassed as a mechanical engineer. Really? That's what you're doing? The Chevy Vega, you had to take the engine mounts loose and tip it to change the spark plug. And we abandoned teaching the metric system. And we took solar panels off the White House. All these things were happening. And I thought, man, the U.S., my beloved home country, is going to heck in a handbasket. And I wanted to influence the future. And I'm not joking you. And that's why I think the Science Guy show got this applause, I think.
So you went from being a scientist, practicing scientist,
Well, mechanical
design-
engineering,
mechanical
using
engineer,
science to make
to-
things and solve problems.
to being on stage, to being in front
Yeah,
of the camera.
yeah.
Difficult transition, or?
Well, it's okay. I started, as some of you may know, by winning in Seattle only the Steve Martin lookalike contest. And because I was pressured by a group of friends who said, "You're just like this guy, man." And I just really respected what he was doing as a comedian, where you have to the audience has to choose when to laugh. You can't force it.
So you like to teach, and you've agreed. Though you will qualify yourself as not an expert in this, but you've studied up for it to give us a little bit of lesson that we can use in this debate about how nuclear power is generated, just basically how it works.
Yeah. So sure. So I bet most people here know that we have discovered electrons, protons, and neutrons. And so there are certain elements that are created in essentially exploding stars that contain energy, primordial energy in them that's still there today. And you've heard of them, uranium. You might have heard of neptunium, which is only would exist for a brief time. Anyway, uranium decays. Some of the neutrons go flying out of it. And if you can get the neutrons to run into each other, it generates heat. And we love heat. We take the heat and we boil water or some coolant and run a turbine, which turns into an electric generator, a magnet, a coil of wire moving through a magnetic field, and we get electricity. So it's heat. And so this is called fission. And it's a process different from what happens inside a star. That's fusion. But it's big atoms falling apart. And the energy of big atoms falling apart we harness. But the same flying apart atom will damage your DNA. And so this is why that's radiation poisoning, or you don't want that, and that's why people are afraid of it.
When people talk about nuclear waste, what is the waste?
So right now, we use a certain fraction of the uranium and then bury or put the rest of it someplace. And there's big concern if bad guys or bad gals got hold of the right amount of uranium, nuclear material. There's another fabulous adjective, fissile material, that which could be fissioned. Then you could make a bomb. And even easier would be to make a bomb that doesn't really explode the way you might think of at Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the mushroom cloud. It's just radioactive, and you blow it all over the place, and then you'll have this mythic thing called radioactive fallout. And fallout is just dust that's now radioactive, that now has these neutrons flying off it, or gamma rays flying off, a high energy electromagnetic radiation like light flying off of it, that damages you and can make you sick, and everybody's afraid of it. And so if the wrong guys got hold of this stuff, it potentially could be really dangerous. And so our nuclear material that we use to fission in reactors is kind of diluted in a solid kind of way, and we bury the leftovers, or that's the goal, is to bury the leftovers.
And how long does that stuff stay hot?
Well, there's some debate. And use the word hot. That's an industry term. That's hot uranium there. That's some hot stainless steel. No, it is. And 10,000 years. So if you're scoring along with us, some of it is only 1,000 years. The Roman Empire, I mean, in astronomy, we just round to the nearest power of 10. That's 10 Roman empires. Like, wow, that's potentially quite dangerous. And what does it say about you as a society that you're willing to, how haughty are you that you're going to bury something that's that dangerous? However, the stuff exists in nature. The dream of nuclear energy when I was growing up is you dig up the material, you mine it, you purify it or concentrate it, fission it, get the energy out, and then bury it again. Sounds cool. What's not to love? But it's been fraught with all sorts of problems.
You have something of a 2 degrees of separation from the discovery of plutonium.
Well, I met the guy. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
So
You met Bob Plutonium, right?
yeah. So at the California Science Teachers Association, Glenn Seaborg who, unlike many of us here, had a Nobel Prize. Anybody? Sure. And he got it for nuclear physics. He discovered or created or invented plutonium. And this is in Hanford, Washington State. I don't know if you've ever been, you may have been to Seattle. Western Washington is the Evergreens and everything, but Eastern Washington is like this separate prairie, desertish kind of place, semi-arid place. And so that's where they were messing around with these potentially very dangerous materials. So we had lunch. There were 8 of us around the table. And he said, Bill, he was in his 80s. I'm doing my best Glenn Seaborg here. Bill, they wanted me to call it plutonum. But come on, plutonium sounds a lot cooler. Yes, Dr. C, yes, it sounds way cooler. And then he went on, he said they wanted the atomic symbol to be PT, plutonium. But he said he insisted that it be PU. The atomic symbol, if you look at the periodic table, atomic symbol is PU, he said, because this stuff stinks. And he understood just how crazy dangerous it is. You know, if you have powdered plutonium and you breathe it, you're gone. I mean, you're not going to live. And so plutonium, it turns out uranium is 92 protons, plutonium's 94, and it has more energy and is more extraordinary. More extraordinary? Is extraordinary. And you can make the mythic plutonium weapon, which is a super powerful nuclear weapon. And the dream of, I imagine people, what I'd like to hear is one of the ideas is to take uranium and breed it, that's a verb, into plutonium, and then use the plutonium to make heat and energy and electricity. But plutonium is nominally dangerous, and but at the Planetary Society, one of the things we've strongly advocated for, there's the word isotope, which is, so the atomic number is how many protons. The isotope has extra includes the number of neutrons. Protons and neutrons weigh almost exactly the same or have the same mass. So plutonium-239 is what you use to make weapons. Plutonium-238 is what we use in spacecraft because it stays hot for decades, stays orange hot for decades. And so with the right thermocouples or sort of equivalent of solar panels encasing the plutonium, you get electricity for decades. And the 2 Voyager spacecraft, which have gone beyond the solar system, or as far as anything's ever gone, rely on plutonium. They're both still working. Launched in 1977, they're still working. The Curiosity rover on Mars has plutonium-238, it's still working. So that aside, that stuff's cool, but we're here to talk about nuclear power, right? Which is a different use of this stuff.
A term we are likely to hear tonight, what is a sievert?
Oh, a sievert. Your sievert, that's 100 rem. That's what she is.
Yeah. I think we all knew that.
Yeah, so since the 1940s, people have messed around with trying to decide what the biological effects of ionizing radiation, this stuff, will do to you. And they came up with this thing, Röntgen equivalent man. It wasn't W, it was M. And this is how much damage it would do to you. So a sievert now, what we all want, I quote, of course, Ernst Rutherford, all science is either physics or stamp collecting, meaning all science is either physics or just keeping track of, other things. So chemistry is really physics and biology is really chemistry, so biology is really physics. So it's all, yeah. So sievert is based on the fundamental units of meters, seconds, and kilograms. And so it's based on, if you have a volume of air and you ionize what would be an amp, a coulomb, or an amp of electricity, then, and you put that on a person, how much damage does it do? That's what a sievert is based on. And let me just put it this way. Every year we get 2 or 3 millisieverts, 1,000th of a sievert. If you were to get 5 sieverts, 5,000 millisieverts, you'd almost certainly die. Half the people in the world would die within 60 days. And this is, at Chernobyl was the famous thing or infamous thing. where people got a lot of sieverts and they died. And radiation poisoning is this crazy, complicated thing. It breaks down your DNA, your fast-producing cells like in your intestine. That's why people start vomiting. And if it gets in your lungs, the fast-producing cells, it's just really weird stuff. So you don't breathe plutonium, you know.
I always love to leave things on a positive note.
But here's the thing, it's very well understood. I mean, I'll give them that
Okay.
it's very well understood, and I'm sure this is going to come up. You know, we've had 3 just really weird nuclear events. 3 Mile Island, which is in Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania. It's right at the end of the runway, and they had a leak, and the evacuation plan sent people in the same opposite directions across the same bridge. That was nothing exactly went wrong, but it's undesirable. And then Chernobyl was just a mess. I mean, a dangerous, horrible mess, killing people, estimate, 4,000 people or something. And then now Fukushima. And so these are three, so these are 3 accidents that, okay, there's industrial accidents all the time.
Since we're getting into the debate material here.
Well, here's what I want to hear from these guys and gal, is the problem is the public is aware of these things, and how are we going to address that? Sorry to go on a big digression there.
I want to say this to end it on a positive note. It has been a pleasure and an honor
and
a lesson. Thank you very much, Bill Nye.
It's changed the world.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, John. Thanks for that extra bit. Sorry I didn't mean to mess
That's
it up.
okay.
Cool.
Thanks.
Let's listen. Let's hear what they have to say. Critical thinking.
The place names will scare you. 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, Chernobyl, places where catastrophic accidents at nuclear power plants made the case, at least critics of nuclear power argued, that nuclear is just too dangerous for any society to consider building into its future. And so for many years, for many people, the sun had seemed to be setting on nuclear as a way to keep the lights on. But you know what other quality nuclear power has? It is virtually carbon-free. Its impact on global warming is virtually negligible, which raises the question, if we are looking for ways to mitigate climate change, should nuclear be getting a new look? Would the risk of nuclear be worth it, or is it riskier not to go more nuclear? Well, we think in all of these questions we have the makings of a debate, so let's have it. Yes or no to this statement: it's time to expand nuclear power. I'm John Donvan, and I stand between 2 teams of 2 experts in this topic who will argue for and against the resolution. As always, our debate will go in 3 rounds, and then our live audience here at the Florence School of Theater in New York City will vote to choose the winner. And if all goes well, civil discourse will also win. Again, our resolution is, it's time to expand nuclear power. Let's meet our debaters. Please first welcome on the team arguing for the resolution, ladies and gentlemen, Kirsty Gogan.
Oh, that's you guys. Oh.
Kirsty, this is just to say hello to you. Kirsty, you are the co-founder and executive director of Energy for Humanity. That's an NGO that is focused on decarbonization and on energy access. You flew in from London to join us. It's so great to have you here.
And thanks so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
It's our pleasure. Kirsty Gogan, everybody. And let's meet your partner. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Poneman. Dan, you have some government service related to this issue. You are former Deputy Secretary of Energy in the Obama administration. You're now President and CEO of a global energy company that is supplying enriched uranium for commercial nuclear power plants. It is called Centrus Energy. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to have you here. And of course, we have 2 debaters arguing against the resolution. Please first welcome Gregory Jaczko. Greg, also a person with government service in this issue, you are a former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, after which you wrote a book, the title of which was Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator. And you are now the founder of an energy company called Wind Future LLC. Greg, it's great to have you on Intelligence Squared US.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And let's meet your partner. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Arjun Makhijani. Arjun, longtime expert in this field. You're the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research, and you're author of a book called Carbon Free and Nuclear Free, a roadmap for U.S. energy policy. You have spent decades studying nuclear disarmament and energy efficiency. It's great to have somebody like you here. Thanks so much for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, our four debaters arguing on the resolution, it's time to expand nuclear power. Let's move on to our debate. Let's start with round one. Round one will be opening statements by each debater in turn. Up speaking first for the resolution, it's time to expand nuclear power. Please welcome everyone, Dan Poneman, former Deputy Secretary of Energy.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I'm going to start by asking a question. How many people here believe that climate change is a global environmental crisis that requires our best efforts to address? Wow. I would say that's a vast majority. I agree with you. Evidence supports your concern. We've just experienced the 10 hottest years in history of the planet. We are looking at a future of mid-century in which we could see 99% of our coral reefs gone that support 500 million people. Arctic sea ice in the summer gone. Hundreds of millions of people displaced. And what are we doing about it? We have a Paris Climate Agreement that pledges to get to 2 degrees centigrade global warming over pre-industrial levels, or better yet, 1.5 degrees. But in fact, we're way off track. If you took all of the pledges that the countries that signed up for the Paris Climate Agreement undertook to support that agreement and assumed they did everything they promised to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, you blow right past 2 degrees centigrade. You don't get close to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And of course, are governments ever on track with their pledges? Of course not. So here we are 5 years later, and 2/3 of the major emitters are already off track. So how are we going to get back on track? First, consider the scope of the problem and the urgency. By 2050, electricity consumption will increase by 100%. That's necessary to sustain the growth of the world and the prosperity of the people who live there. In that same period of time, scientists tell us we've got to cut carbon emissions from electricity production by 100%. Electricity is the easy one to solve before you get to transportation and building, heat, and agriculture. Now, I love renewables, and I was proud as Deputy Secretary of Energy to chair a credit review board that put $30 billion of loan guarantees to work and started the first utility-scale grid solar photovoltaic industry in this country, that supported the largest wind farm in this country, that put the Tesla on the road, supported biorefineries and geothermal and storage. All great stuff. But guess what? If you did all that, it still doesn't get you to decarbonizing the electricity sector by 2050. Now, don't ask me. If you go to the International Energy Agency or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they will all tell you the only way to close that gap is by a significant expansion of nuclear power. Now, we've already heard some from Bill Nye, thank you, and we'll hear more about waste and radiation, etc. I'm going to focus just one moment on one of the problems that's a deep concern of many, the spread of nuclear weapons. And I'm here to tell you that nuclear weapons have not historically spread through commercial nuclear power. To the contrary, I can tell you of a case when the Soviet Union broke up. I was privileged to be part of a team that negotiated the purchase of 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium from the Soviet Union, the former Soviet arsenal, 20,000 weapons worth. And we blended it down to commercial reactor fuel, supplied 1/2 of US commercial nuclear requirements for 20 years. And since commercial nuclear is 20% of US electricity, for 20 years, 1 in 10 light bulbs in America was lit up by a former nuclear weapon pointing at you. So don't accept easy bromides. Fear of nuclear power has killed many more people than nuclear power has killed. Consider Germany. After Fukushima, they closed 8 reactors. Since that time, 1,100 people per year have lost their lives because of coal-fired pollution. The question presented then is, are we going to put everything we've got into this fight to prevent disaster to our planet? Or are we going to leave the most prodigious source of carbon-free energy in history on the table and hope for the best? That's why I say it is time to expand nuclear power.
Thank you, Dan Poneman. Our next debater will be speaking against that very resolution. It's time to expand nuclear power. Please welcome Arjun Makhijani, President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. Ladies and gentlemen, Arjun Makhijani.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all your work on solar energy and storage and so on. You were very successful, and that'll be part of my story. We do need to eliminate carbon dioxide, no disagreement. We don't have a shortage of low CO2 sources of energy, but we have a shortage of 2 things in solving the climate crisis. We have a shortage of time, and we have a shortage of money. Nuclear energy is really bad for both. In 2005, there was a big announcement with fanfare around then of the nuclear renaissance. More than 30 reactor applications were made to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And as in the previous generation of nuclear, most of them were canceled. Only 4 started construction. 2 of those 4 were canceled after billions of dollars of expenditures. The other 2, being built in Georgia, are years and years behind schedule and billions of dollars of cost overruns. We can't afford that kind of delay. We can't afford power plants that take 10 and 15 years to build. We have seen this scene before. In the first round of nuclear, almost as many reactors, about 100, were canceled as were built. The financial scene was so bad that Forbes, not known as an anti-nuclear group, Forbes said, and this is a quote, the nuclear power, quote, is the largest managerial disaster in business history. It is a disaster on a monumental scale. February 1985. That was the first round. What should we do now? Fortunately, as a result of a lot of good work in this country, Department of Energy, Germany, and other places, today, utility-scale solar and wind are cheaper than nuclear. $40 a megawatt hour for solar and wind, $155 a megawatt hour. Did I make this up by somebody who doesn't like nuclear power? No. These numbers are published every year as estimates for new power plant by Lazard, Wall Street, also not known as an anti-nuclear group. So I'm giving you bow tie credentials. You saw the guy with the bow tie. So I'm giving you bow tie numbers. In reality, nuclear power tends to get more expensive as they get in, and solar and wind, the history is they've gotten much, much cheaper. So of course, solar and wind are variable. So there's a delta between $40 and $155. You do need storage, you do need a smart grid, you need investments, and so on. So instead of saying, oh, you need everything, I actually did years of work to figure out what would it take, what would it cost, and how do you compare to business as usual. And I did it with actual data for the state in which I live, Maryland. I used the demand data, your heating, your cooling, your dishwasher, your refrigerator, hour by hour modeling. I have it in my computer in my hotel room down the street. I also got hour by hour data for wind. I got hour by hour data for solar. I added the smart grid, I added the storage, battery, 5 hours of storage. It's cheaper than business as usual, 10 to 20% cheaper. And since I finished my calculations, solar and wind are cheaper now than they were back then. So twice it's gone bad with nuclear. We have the answers. So now we're told small modular reactors are going to come along because large reactors take too long and they're too expensive. And small modular reactors, we're going to do mass manufacturing. And because there'll be a supply chain, mass manufacturing, they'll be cheaper. Well, when you go from large to small, you lose something that's well known called economies of scale. When you go to mass manufacturing, you also gain something. It's called the possibility of recalls. How are you going to recall a radioactive reactor that's now in the center of your electricity system? No answers. I seem to be the only one that's actually raised this question. I haven't gotten an answer yet. And these reactors are vulnerable to problems. Now you've got a costly reactor. It's not going to be cheaper than what existing reactors are. In fact, a recent report to the state of Maryland said that small modular reactors will likely be more expensive.
Arjun, I'm sorry, I have to break in because your time is up.
I will finish. This is a mirage.
Thank you very much. And a reminder of where we are halfway through the opening round of this Intelligence Squared US debate. I'm John Donvan. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, arguing it out over this resolution. It is time to expand nuclear power. You have heard from the first 2 debaters, and now on to the third. Welcoming to the lectern, our third debater. Please give a round of applause for Kirsty Gogan, co-founder and executive director of Energy for Humanity.
Thank you. My younger self would be shocked that I'm here on this stage today arguing in favor of this motion to expand nuclear energy. I've dedicated my life to working on environmental and social justice. After college, I was a grassroots environmental activist, planting trees, boycotting flying, organizing protests against GMOs and cars and nuclear weapons and globalization. And I don't usually do debates. I'm more of a coalition builder, more interested in common ground than arguing. And yet here I am because, frankly, so much is at stake. Changing my mind about nuclear energy felt like betraying my tribe. It was hard to admit that I was wrong, hard to be judged, even excluded by my friends, for challenging the environmental anti-nuclear touchstone. But climate change made me reevaluate nuclear energy, and it was a shock to find that I'd been wrong about the risks that I thought were real, about our chances of making a real dent in climate change without it. But despite 30 years of successfully building public and political support for action on climate change, we have not made a dent in the upward trajectory of emissions. In fact, incredibly, half of the emissions that are currently in the atmosphere today, we've emitted in the past 30 years, since Al Gore published his first book on climate change. And now, according to the IPCC, we have another 30 years, just 30 more years, to fully decarbonize the whole of the global economy, not just the power sector, industry, heat, transport. Now, 2050 may seem like a distant future, but in 2050, my daughter will be the age that I am now. And meanwhile, today, humans live safer, longer, more productive, healthier, more secure lives than at any other time. And that prosperity, that modern life, depends on massive amounts of electricity, reliable energy. And yet, half the people in the world still lack access to enough energy. Many depend on dangerous smoky fuels for cooking and for lighting in their homes, and this lack of access to modern energy causes millions of deaths every year, disproportionately affecting women and children. In households without access to electricity, women can spend up to 35 hours a week just collecting fuel. So this isn't just an environmental issue. It's an ethical issue. It's a public health issue. It's a feminist issue. So not only do we have to replace the entire global fossil fuel infrastructure within those 30 years, but probably double or even triple it to meet rising global energy demand and bring modern energy services to all people. So in light of this, Many organizations, including the Union of Concerned Scientists, the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, have started to change their stance on nuclear energy. And I looked again at the evidence, and I found that the facts didn't justify my opposition. And yeah, even taking into account, those famous accidents, nuclear energy is the safest form of electricity generation. In fact, coal kills way more people in a single day of normal operations than 60 years of global energy has, even including those 3 big accidents. In fact, for decades, nuclear energy has been the single largest source of clean electricity generation in the United States and in Europe, and is recognized by the world's most credible authorities as being a critical part of our response to the climate emergency. So this isn't about nuclear versus renewables. The simple truth is actually that tackling climate change will be more expensive, more difficult, and more likely to fail if we exclude nuclear energy. Now, climate, okay, it's a complicated problem, but you know what? Mostly it's an energy problem. And broadly speaking, you can boil it down to a simple 2-step strategy. So first of all, expand clean electricity generation, and then electrify the hell out of everything. Some modern industrialized economies, they've already achieved the first step. You know what success looks like from a climate perspective? It looks like France and it looks like Sweden today. Sweden holds the record for the fastest and most complete clean electricity transition, completely phasing out fossil fuels. And you know how they did that? They did that whilst growing their economy with some of the lowest energy bills in Europe. How did they do it? With the only proven, real-world way that we know how. They did it with a combination of nuclear and renewables. But there's something else. As a humanitarian and environmentalist, the real appeal of nuclear energy is its incredible energy density, thousands of times more energy dense than coal, which means it can power whole civilizations with a tiny ecological footprint. And what about the waste? I used to worry about the waste, but it turns out that waste streams from nuclear energy are trivial compared to fossil combustion. Waste has not, will not, and does not cause harm to people and the environment.
Kirsty, I'm sorry, I have to jump in. Your time is up as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Kirsty Gogan. And please welcome to his lectern our final debater on the resolution. It's time to expand nuclear power. Here is Gregory Jaczko, former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
It's always nice to go last because you get to hear everybody's arguments. And although I have to say, I haven't heard much in the way of arguments. What we've heard a lot is what I like to call it's the unicorn nuclear industry. There's a lot of statements that were made by Kirsty, by Dan, about this impassioned need to deal with climate change, and I agree 100%. And in fact, what I actually worry about is we have a lot of people talking about nuclear in that way, and talking as if nuclear is the thing that's going to solve this problem for us. And in fact, it's actually not. You didn't hear a lot of facts about the nuclear industry, about what it really takes to build nuclear power in the way that they're talking about. So let's talk about those facts. First of all, right now, today, and it's not just electricity that matters, it's energy, right? There's more to energy, there's more to what we use for energy than just electricity. And today, 4% of energy in the world is produced by nuclear power, okay? If we look at electricity, it's about 10, 11, 12%. Renewables are bigger than that in both cases, both for energy and electricity today. So renewables already have a head start, okay? But moreover, when you look at the biggest issues, they talked about 2050. 2050 is a very important date from the climate perspective. But more importantly is 2030. Most of the modeling shows that by 2030, we have to make significant reductions in our carbon footprint in the world. If you take a typical nuclear power plant today, and remember that 4% or that 10 or 11%, to get to a substantial amount of nuclear power, tomorrow, we need to start building thousands of nuclear power plants in the world, because it takes anywhere from 10 to 15 years to build a nuclear power plant when you start from scratch. And that's on the conservative beneficial end. It could be anywhere from 15 to 20 years to do that. Okay, so we're talking about tomorrow starting to build over 1,000, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 nuclear power plants. And that's not just in countries like the US or France that have existing nuclear power programs, it's places all over the world. Well, to do that, they can't just start from scratch, or they can't just start and magically bring out a wand and build a nuclear power plant. They need engineers, they need welders, they need people with experience dealing with this technology. And that takes another 5, 10 years to build up that infrastructure and that capacity to build, license, and operate nuclear power plants. And I know, I was the regulator of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the head regulator in the United States. That infrastructure does not come easy. We had over 4,000 people, or close to 4,000 people in my agency. And I would visit other countries that were desperate to have nuclear power programs, and that was what they came to us and said, can you help us build our infrastructure? So we could all agree today that this is a great thing, nuclear power is wonderful. But the practical reality is we cannot build the amount of nuclear power plants we need in order to make a real dent in climate change in the next 10 to 15 years. But I worried about this for a long, long time because I have 2 small children. I have a 4-year-old daughter and a about to be 7-year-old son. And I worried about the future, and I've always been conflicted, having dealt with the Fukushima nuclear accident at the NRC. And I thought, my gosh, I'm concerned about this technology, but I'm more concerned about climate change. And so I began to realize and look and learn and recognize that, in fact, the cheapest and fastest growing sources of clean energy in the world are renewables. Hydro and renewables, what we call kind of when we say renewables, we think of wind and solar and geothermal and these kinds of things. Those are the fastest growing sources of energy, and Dan talked about Germany. Today, Germany generates 40% of its electricity from renewables, including hydro. The problems with people dying have nothing to do with renewables, they have to do with coal. It's coal that's killing people in Germany, and that coal use has actually gone down over the last 10 years, largely replaced by natural gas and renewables, which have gone in the last 10 to 15 years from about a few percent to 40% of the generation of electricity in Germany. And nuclear has gone down. In the United States, nuclear power has been at about 20% of our electricity generation for decades. Right? If this is such a great technology, why hasn't it been doing all these wonderful beneficial things? Why hasn't it been eliminating coal deaths for the last 30, 40, 50 years? Because it's been impractical to build. We started out in this country with plans to build over 200 nuclear power plants. That got whittled down to 100 or so. When I was chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there were 104 operating reactors. Today, we have fewer than that. So it's going in the wrong direction, and the prices are going up. Renewables are going in the right direction, and their prices are going down. So we don't have to make this choice between the difficult challenges of nuclear power versus climate change. We have better alternatives that exist today that we can deploy in the time frame that we need to actually make a real dent in climate change in the next 10 years, not in the next 30 or 40 years. So remember, when you hear about the nuclear industry, think about the unicorn. That's the industry that they're talking about. It's a unicorn industry. It's a wonderful, beautiful, mythical creature, and it doesn't exist in the real world.
Thank you, Greg Jaczko. And that concludes round 1 of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where our resolution is, it's time to expand nuclear power. Now we move on to round 2, and round 2 is where the debaters address one another directly. They also take questions from me and a little bit later on from you, members of our live audience here in New York City. Our resolution is, it's time to expand nuclear power. We've heard a range of arguments between the two sides. We've also heard some common ground. Let's stake out what that is first of all. Both sides agree that climate change is real and urgent, that time is running out. They agree that the world's need for electricity consumption is going up, perhaps by as much as 100% in a short period of time. They agree that renewables have a place and that increasing renewable energy is a worthy goal. They agree that coal is very, very damaging to human health. Where they disagree is on the question of whether nuclear is too dangerous to be the solution to climate change as part of the mix, or whether it is too expensive or too impractical. The team arguing for the resolution are arguing that that is not the case at all. They say that with the clock ticking, the only way to get the situation dealt with quickly enough would be through nuclear power. They say that nuclear is actually the only option. And they say it has to be a critical part of the whole solution. They cite examples of nations like Sweden and France, which they say have already figured this out. They also make the argument that fear of nuclear power is actually more dangerous than nuclear power itself, that the issue, we were just getting to that in Kirsty's opening, that the issue of waste is somewhat exaggerated and the harm is somewhat exaggerated. I'd like to get more into that, into the conversation itself. The team arguing against the resolution, Arjun, Makhijani, and Gregory, they also argue that time is running out, but they say that in the issue of dealing with climate change in the next 10 years, that with time and money short, renewables actually beat out nuclear. They say that nuclear power plants have proven again and again to be too expensive and to take too long to get up and running. They say that, in fact, renewables are getting cheaper and spreading, and they basically make the argument that the choice between the danger of nuclear power and a carbon-free world is a false choice, that we have other options. So there is a lot there for us to dig into. I want to go to the side arguing for the resolution and take a piece of the argument I heard from your opponents. I'll start with either of you would like to go for it first. Your opponents have made the argument, countering your argument that nuclear is the only solution, by saying, look at the record of the last 20 years. Nuclear power plants just can't get off the ground. We're decreasing the number of nuclear power plants. They take too long. I'm not sure if they're arguing for practical construction reasons, design reasons, bureaucratic reasons, but that it's in a world where they say we're going to need thousands of nuclear power plants in a short period of time to be the solution, that it's just incredibly impractical. Who would like to take that?
Yeah, so nuclear energy is proven over and over as being absolutely the fastest way to add clean electricity generation per capita. And, you know, the perception right now in Europe and in the United States around the idea that nuclear is too expensive and too slow to make a meaningful contribution towards solving climate change is informed by, honestly, what's a really small sample of first-of-a-kind, first-of-a-generation projects. And they're not representative of the vast majority of nuclear plants that are being built in the world today.
You're referring to plants that were built 30, 40 years ago?
No, I mean, I'm talking about the projects that are still being built today in Europe and in the United States and the UK and here in the United States that give the impression that nuclear is expensive and slow. But actually, those projects are first-of-a-generation plants that have to be licensed with an inexperienced regulator. You have to qualify the supply chain, you have to train the labor force, you have to establish your siting process, and then you have to build it for the first time. We would expect to see at least a 30% reduction from the first of a kind to a second of a kind, and then further cost reductions with subsequent plants. And the way that we form that impression is through experience of programs being very successfully delivering projects in a very time-efficient way that are cost competitive, not only with fossil fuels, but also with renewables.
So to boil it down, you're saying the more we build, if we were to start building them, the more we build, the faster we would get at it. It would get better.
The first one you build is difficult and expensive, and after that, it gets
Let me take that
much
logic
easier.
to your opponents.
Well, I mean, again, we can go to facts. I mean, I was the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when we licensed the Vogtle and Summer plants in the United States, which were, to a certain extent, first of a kind. The industry was well aware that they had to meet costs and schedule timelines, and they assured me of that repeatedly because they knew that Wall Street would not fund additional projects because there had been a history of cost delays and cost overruns throughout the entire U.S. nuclear industry and really in many places in the world. That one of those projects is now over 5 years behind schedule and over $15 billion over budget. And that was not a new project. I mean, it was a new project, but this was not with an untrained regulator. This was not with an untrained workforce. The industry had been doing plant upgrades and other major modifications to plants in order to train that workforce to be prepared to do it. They simply mismanaged the project, which is typical of how the nuclear.
But is it inevitable? I mean, your opponents are saying that's not inevitable, and that with experience, that process could get more streamlined.
Well, I mean, they've been saying that for 30 years. I mean, that's nothing new in the nuclear industry. So, we can continue to make those statements. And again, perhaps in 15 years, we'll find out that it's not true.
Dan?
Mark Twain once said, "A cat who sits on a hot stove lid will not sit on a hot stove lid again, but he also will not sit on a cold stove lid." So let's not learn the wrong lessons from history. When we got going as a country, we built 104 nuclear units. Those units produce electricity at 3 cents per kilowatt hour. That's cheap. That's cheap. And when you add into the cost of solar and wind, which I love, transmission and the backup power you're going to need, it's very competitive. So I think it's critical to realize when you do get this kind of momentum, what you can do in a scarce decade. One example will suffice. Kirsty just came back from Sweden. In their biggest year of building nuclear power, they added 600 kilowatt hours per person per year. Germany, in its most ambitious decade of wind and solar expansion, added 120 kilowatt hours per person per year. France, 450 kilowatt hours per person per year. These are facts. California, 70 kilowatt hours. And that's what you have to measure. It's not just the installed capacity. So when Greg talks about the installed capacity for wind and solar expanding, that's great. But since the wind does not blow and the sun does not shine, you have to divide that by how often it's available.
Let me bring in Arjun.
Yeah. So this idea that we're building completely new power plants, first of a kind, is a little stretches the truth. These power plants, the AB 1000 that is being built, were supposed to be streamlined, learn lessons from 3 Mile Island, safer, faster. The regulator said, we've streamlined the regulatory process, we'll give you a license for the site and the operating license all at the same time, so it'll be faster, cheaper, and better. As it turned out, it hasn't been faster, it hasn't been cheaper, it hasn't been better. The fundamental design of the nuclear power plants that are being built here in France and in Finland and so on has not changed. They're all light water reactors. They all boil water either directly or through steam generators, and they all run a steam turbine. They all have the same kind of controls with control rods. So there's nothing fundamentally different about this technology. It is the same technology that was actually supposed to be better. Now, I'm not a fan of Wall Street, but I do think that they do look to the dollars and cents and what's going to fatten their pockets. And there was a reason that they didn't finance it. They got burned the first time around. Think why Forbes would take on a really big business like nuclear, supported by the government with free insurance, essentially free insurance, on your back and my back if there's an accident, a major accident, and say this was the largest managerial disaster in business history. And they didn't fund the second round.
Let's bring in Kirsty.
Yeah, so I sometimes make a joke that the next time I convert my loft, it's going to be like really efficiently done. Unfortunately, I won't have that opportunity, but we do have that opportunity to learn from the experience of building the first of a kind. And you know, the first of a kind costs of licensing and training and qualifying the supply chain, they don't have to be spent again. So my question really is, you know, why wouldn't we apply the same effort and resources to driving down cost and driving up rates of deployment for all low carbon technologies? Why would we just apply that learning to drive down the costs
Why?
of
Let's
wind
take
and
that
solar? Because actually the really important thing that matters, sorry, just to finish the point, is the overall performance of the system. Actually, what we really care about is that our energy system is clean and reliable and affordable and flexible and ultimately cheap. And what we know, what the evidence is very clear on, is that the best way to deliver the performance of that system and the low-cost system and the clean system is through a combination of nuclear and renewables. And so why wouldn't we apply the same effort to driving down the cost as we have done successfully for wind and solar?
Well, again, I think, again, we're trying to create an impression that the nuclear industry is just brand new industry that's just doing all these things. It's been around for 60 years. We, in fact, have been doing all those things. They just haven't worked. So you have to...
We've been operating the plants for 60 years, and in some ways that's a great asset that they last so long. But on the other hand, we end up
you talked about
losing
specific,
the capability of building new projects, which is the thing that I'm talking about, which we haven't done for more than 2 decades in this country.
Right. You said, why wouldn't we put those efforts to driving down costs? The industry did put significant resources and effort into driving down costs. In the United States, for instance, the industry created trade schools that were specifically designed to train the workers to build the plants in Georgia, to build the plants in South Carolina. And the plants are still wildly over budget and over cost. So the industry has been spending money on those things. It's just not worked.
Well, it has in the past, very successfully driven down costs.
Let me bring Dan in.
Yeah. I think it's important to recognize that after 3 Mile Island, we had a 30-year hiatus. A 30-year hiatus in which our talent pool dissipated, in which our supply pool atrophied. And therefore, it's not actually accurate to say we've been doing this continuously ever since. Korea is building reactors. Russia is building reactors. Korea is finishing 4 reactors right now in the United Arab Emirates. China is building reactors. They're all doing it cheaper and faster. I refuse to believe that American ingenuity and supply chain and talent pool is not up to the task. We just have to apply ourselves.
Dan and Arjun, I had expected to hear you make more. You're making the economic and time and practicality argument. You haven't talked about the danger argument at all. I'm curious why you haven't said that nuclear is dangerous. Is it because you actually don't think you don't think that that's actually the case?
I don't think it matters because if you have $100 to go do carbon-free electricity, you can build far more with renewables than you can with nuclear, and you can do it faster. So it doesn't matter that you have all these external issues about safety.
That's going back to your saying the choice is not necessary.
The choice is not necessary. Exactly right. We don't have. In many ways, this isn't really a debate anymore. I'll tell you a story. I wrote a book, and as part of my
don't tell me that.
well, I'll just say I wanted to give a talk to a group of finance people in the energy industry, and they said, you wrote a book, you're promoting your book, we'd love to have you come speak, but we don't really have anything for you to talk about because our people know that nuclear is a dead industry. So now the industry is promoting this idea of climate change as a way to try and revive the industry, but in the marketplace, it's not a debate at all. The debate's over, and renewables have won.
Let me bring that to Dan.
I respectfully disagree. Renewables are great, and you can introduce them to the grid 10, 20, maybe even up to 30%, and the grid can absorb it. But after that, you have to compensate, and you have to have backup power, which is usually fossil-fueled, so you're not getting the carbon-free benefit. And in addition, if you're not going to fuel it with carbon-fueled sources, you're going to need batteries. Just one more point here.
Go for it.
Varun Sivaram in Taming the Sun, a brilliant analyst of the solar industry, says that for batteries to support wind and solar providing 100%, as our opponents would have you believe, would require 8 to 16 weeks of battery storage in the United States. We have 43 minutes of it now. And we don't have the transmission lines, which people aren't too keen to build in their backyards either. And so I think we have to put into perspective that you do need, as Kirsty said, a system, and renewables can be a great part of it, but they need to be supported by flexible, dispatchable power, and that's what nuclear provides.
So that was a question I wanted to get to. So there are times when the wind doesn't blow, there are times when the sun's not out, and there's not going to be juice from the system. You need something else. If it's not nuclear, it seems very likely you're going to fire up a gas plant and you're back to carbon emissions again. So they're arguing, let nuclear be that thing that steps into the gap. What about that?
Well, I hope that Mr. Poneman was listening because that's exactly what I laid out. We're not talking about weeks of storage. This is a straw man that is frequently put up. If you have solar, you need weeks and weeks of storage and lots of batteries. Agreed. If you just have solar and batteries, it's not going to work. That's why when I laid it out for you, I said, well, I did the hour-by-hour calculation. Let me give you the numbers. For 68% of the hours, the load is directly and fully met by solar and wind, by renewables, a little bit of hydro. If you have 5 hours of annual average load of battery storage, now this is directly from hour-by-hour modeling, just 5 hours, you get to 96%. The other 4% of the hours is a lot of hours in the year. You don't want to be electric, but you cannot meet it just by adding batteries. So that's why you have a smart grid. Today we have a dumb grid. The amount of intelligence in the switches communicating between your house and the electricity system can all be fitted onto a $10 flash drive. That's how dumb the grid is. You have to have two-way communications. If you have a smart grid, demand response, do you care when the heating element in your frost-free refrigerator in the freezer comes on?
Okay.
But that can be part of a smart grid.
Are you persuaded?
Well, it's kind of not about whether I'm persuaded. It's really about, you know, what all of the kind of best, most credible analysis is telling us. So if you look at the International Energy Agency or, you know, any number of other organizations, including the EIA here in the US, we see a really frightening amount of fossil fuels still on the system, even with very aggressive build-outs, even with very ambitious and very successful build-outs of renewable energy up to mid-century, up to the 2050 point, we see around 60% of fossil fuels still on the system. We're working right now with the National Renewable Energy Lab as part of the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is the annual gathering of ministers that look at how on earth they're going to deliver against the Paris agreements. We're working with NREL with their scenarios for very ambitious renewable build-outs, and we see a lot of gas still on the system. And what we've been doing with them is modeling what happens when you add nuclear in. So this isn't about renewables or nuclear. This is about renewables, and that's actually going to
But your opponents are
deliver
arguing that there
clean-
is a way to do renewables without nuclear and still be
Yeah,
carbon-free
so-
by using technology and artificial
It
intelligence
depends
and
on
smart grids.
where you are, and you know, you can concoct scenarios that are technically feasible. However, they're what we would consider high risk, and there's a real question here about whether that's
What do you mean
a
by
risk
high risk?
that we're prepared to take. A risk associated with narrowing your options very severely. NREL have indicated to us that to achieve the sort of 100% renewables build out in the United States, you'd need to be building 3 1,000-mile transmission lines per year, every year for 30 years. Now, just to give you an idea of what that means, we haven't been able to build one of those in 15 years of trying.
That's true.
Now, that is a very high-risk strategy as far as I'm concerned. And I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it's too high a risk. It's not a risk I'm prepared to take, and it's certainly not a risk that my
It
daughter
seems you're
is
both
prepared
making the
to
same argument against your opponents, that without sufficient effort and intelligence and planning, the other guy's solution can't work. So there.
Well, let me just say, that, again, you know, we can look at modeling. Modeling isn't what matters. What matters is what's happening in the marketplace today. There is nothing stopping nuclear from doing all the things that Dan and Kirsty are saying. Right? This is not a new technology that has laws against it that say you cannot build nuclear power plants. In fact, it's a very established technology that has proven over decades to be too costly and too long to deploy. There's nothing that, you know, the renewables are the new technology.
But why is it working in Sweden, and why is it working in France, and why are the South Koreans building?
It works, but it's been consistent in that because renewables are working in those places too. 65% of Sweden's electricity comes
But you're
from
saying the
renewables.
market is... Okay, go on, sorry.
It's not dominated by nuclear, and it's a small country. France is currently at 80% nuclear, and their intention is to go down over time. So, you know, as I said, what we need if we want to do nuclear is today to start building thousands of nuclear power plants in the world. Today or tomorrow.
Let's do that.
And,
Dan, I want to give you the last word on this, and then I want to go to audience
and I would
questions.
just say,
Okay.
let's do it,
Dan,
but the industry can't.
Okay. First of
That's
all,
the problem.
the rule of holes is when you find yourself at the bottom of a deep hole, stop digging, okay? So it's not just about building thousands. That, with all due respect, is a red herring. First, we got to stop shutting down perfectly well operating plants, point one. Point two, it's mythological to say that it's all a free market and it's just not making it. If there were a burden on carbon, if nuclear were compensated for its unique attributes of always on response, think Hurricane Harvey, people are alive today who would be dead without the nuclear power plants that kept running. I got plenty of calls at Department of Energy from Minnesota and Wisconsin congressmen during the polar vortex when the coal plants and the gas plants shut down and nuclear kept running. So if the market actually appreciated the virtues of nuclear, the fight would be far fairer.
that was 2014. I think we have short memories, but it got really, really cold.
January
here.
2014, last point. Greg, properly focus on facts. In 2011, California got 53% of its power from clean sources, and then it pushed solar and wind a lot over the last 7 years. And after 7 years' effort, in 2018, they were still stuck at 53%, because instead of pushing out carbon, it didn't push out, but it was replacing hydro and nuclear. We have to get to zero. You don't get to zero by staying even or growing our carbon emissions.
I'd like to go to audience questions. Gentleman in the suit. Could you stand up so they can find you? Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tom. My question is, I haven't heard anything about healthcare, and one of the things with nuclear is there is an aspect of healthcare. If you look at actinium-225, PSMA, if you Google search images of that, you'll see patients who go from cancer to no cancer. There are isotopes that are derived from nuclear power through fission products that are used in nuclear medicine. These are necessary for the field. How do you derive these without expansion of nuclear power?
Okay, so my question, if I can refocus it, is nuclear power actually good for practice of certain kinds of medicine? In other words, if we shut down nuclear power plants, we wouldn't be able to do that kind of medicine.
Yeah,
Is that what you're saying? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
How do you
No, I get
adequately
it.
supply these isotopes?
Yes,
Okay.
I agree. We should expand nuclear energy.
Well, that's a surprise.
I thought that question would be directed at us.
It's going to come
Well,
back to you.
yeah.
Because we need actually to urgently build more nuclear reactors to produce
Okay.
nuclear material. That's
Well-
for nuclear medicine, for things like prognosis and cancer treatment. That's absolutely right.
All of our questions
I
will
have
go
a
to
little
both
bit of
sides. Let me
news
take Arjun.
for nuclear isotopes for medicine are not produced in nuclear power reactors. They're mostly produced in nuclear research reactors, which are very small, and you don't need very many. The value of isotopes which are used in medicine, and none of us would argue that they shouldn't be, is very, very great. It's not like 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is energy. You have to produce energy cheaply for the economy to run. Nuclear isotopes can be very expensive because healthcare is expensive. You can make it cheaper. Research reactors, nobody's arguing that we shouldn't be making nuclear isotopes. You need a couple of research reactors. You can make them in accelerators. There are a lot of ways to make isotopes
I think
without
we've-
making power. In
I
fact,
think-
we don't make.
I think we've dealt with that. If
Great.
you can stand up. Sir, if you can tell us your name.
Hi there, my name's Chris.
Chris, Chris as in Chris Anderson, who founded TED Talks.
Well, kind of.
Well,
Didn't
welcome
actually
to...
run.
welcome.
Really interesting debate. I mean, I'm surprised at the level of agreement that it's not been a debate about safety primarily. It's really a debate about economics.
Yeah.
Two different versions. And it would help me to have each of you address this from the point of view of what the world needs to do by 2050. You've both got a vision for the grid that the world needs, the energy solution. Not the a lot of the conversation has been about the US. Model this for the world. On the one hand, a grid using nuclear power and renewables in the right mix that you like. If to build out, basically what I've heard you say is at least 2x what fossil fuels are currently delivering. What is the cost that the world is going to have to invest over the next 30 years? And on the other side, if we just go the renewables route, you have to include, obviously, the cost of all these batteries and so forth. How much difference are we talking about? Or do you each have an approximate number there? Because I think we can get lost in the detail. We want to know what the overall math is.
Thank you. Let's let Dan take that on one side and one of you from the other side.
It's a great question. Life is full of compared to what's. And I think what you have to look at, I can't give you an integer of a sum certain of it's going to cost X, okay? But what I can tell you is that the MIT researchers who have analyzed this will tell you that if you try to get all the way there with only renewables, it will cost you 60% more, and that's conservative. And if something's more expensive, you buy less of it. And if you buy less of it, it's going to be slower. And then we're going to blow past 2050. So all those massive investments that Kirsty was talking about in long-distance transmission lines, which they just closed down a 7-year effort to build one from Oklahoma to the southeast, all of that backup power that you're going to have to build to back up the 90 days in Texas when you don't have any wind, that's going to be enormously expensive. And if you want to do it all with solar and wind, you're going to have to so massively overbuild on that side. You're going to be paying people, as is now happening in California, sending electricity to Arizona, when you have got too much power on the grid and you can't use it.
Other side.
And so it's much more expensive. The cheap way to get the job done is by nuclear supplementing renewables.
Other side?
I mean,
Well, so I actually did the calculation. It took 4 years. When you compare the capital investment in renewables compared to business as usual, the capital investment is comparable. So you don't come out ahead one way or another going this way or that way. Where you come out ahead is when you have solar and wind, the operating maintenance costs are very low, and you have no fuel costs. You have zero fuel costs. So why is it cheaper? Because after you take into account, and you can't do it with batteries and solar and wind alone, you do have to have a smart grid. So we have to change out our infrastructure. Do we need thousands of miles of new transmission lines? No. In fact, if you want, as you know, in New York City, just down the street here across the bridge, they did not build a new power plant after Hurricane Sandy. They decided to do solar and storage because a local distributed system would not have been down for a whole week after Hurricane Sandy. If you want resilience, we have to change the model of the electricity sector, even if climate, even if CO2 were not a problem, just the intense storms and the severity of what we're experiencing, and that we cannot suffer electricity disruption for a week. That would lead you to solar and wind and storage and flexible and smart grids and electrified transport.
Okay, I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
Kirsty, can you give 30 seconds on this?
Let me just try and answer the question, right? So we've got 30 years to make it or 30 years to break it. That's the situation. So we just published an article recently called All of Our Climate Solutions Need to Be Impossible Burgers. And the idea behind that is that when I was starting my pro-nuclear environmental NGO, someone was giving me advice and he said, you know what, you think nuclear is controversial? Try meat. Because actually the number one thing that an individual can do to reduce their personal carbon footprint is to eat less meat. And no politician wants to tell anybody to eat less meat, let me tell you. And then the Impossible Burger came along, and now it's saturated the market. It's available in every Burger King. And it's just, it's cost equivalent, it's tasty, it's still junk food, everybody loves it. And we've kind of cut through the problem. So we need all of our climate solutions to be like that. And the reason that I advocate for nuclear energy is not just because it's just about the power sector, because actually what we haven't talked about today is that this is the whole economy. That's heat and industry and transport and shipping and aviation. And frankly, we cannot base our climate mitigation strategies on behavior change or using less energy. What we need is cheap substitutes. And nuclear technology is uniquely suited to produce those clean synthetic drop-in fuels that we can use in airplanes and we can use in ships because it's got a tiny environmental footprint, it's scalable, and it produces high temperature heat. And guess what? We can use that high temperature heat so long as it's cheap enough to make hydrogen and to make other carbon-based fuels so that we can switch out diesel, we can switch out gas.
yeah, let me just say.
Wait,
And we can do it fast.
Let me just say.
I had said 30 seconds.
I'm sorry.
You do 15?
Yeah,
my
the big.
job.
It's very short.
Fine.
The big element of what Kirsty just said is if it's cheap enough, it's not. So you can generate high
Let's
temperature
make it
fluids
cheap.
with solar. You can do the same kinds of things. But just to get to Chris's point very briefly, we also have to think about this deployment. We're not just talking about deploying in Germany, in the United States. We're talking about rural India. What is a good solution in rural India? Well, a good solution in rural India is solar. They've done a tremendous amount of solar right now. So, and these are solutions that are happening today. Meanwhile, India struggles with building out its its nuclear program. So the practical solutions that actually work in much of the world are not large power plants. It's distributed power that can be rapidly deployed without a lot of technical capability and without a lot of infrastructure.
Okay, let's
And
get
that's
to
the
that
better
question
solution
in
for
the back
most
up
of the
there.
world.
Up at the top row, there's a gentleman standing up.
Well, I do want to talk about Fukushima. In addition to the technical aspects of the meltdown, subsequent reporting uncovered just an industry that had become laden with cronyism and decay and entropy and rot. But that's also true of a lot of other human
So what's your
endeavors.
question?
So is there something about the nuclear industry? Is the nuclear industry just worse in those aspects than the renewable industry? Because it's a human endeavor, and should we just not put our faith in these human systems that is we call this nuclear industry that
Okay.
has proven fallible?
Let me take that question to either Dan or I think that's like a big softball to you guys. So I'm going to let this side respond to it and maybe get in one more question.
Well, I'll
And it's been somewhat hinted at that it's a very problematic business, is what your opponents have been saying, and the questioner is putting an even moral spin on it.
Human nature is a constant. I will tell you, having worked in and around this business for 45 years, I have found people of extraordinary integrity. I know of no other industry that internalizes all of its costs. You know, the other industries have lots of waste. We account for the waste. We contain the waste. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there's infallibility in any industry. I think human nature is human nature. What I can tell you is we have to keep our eye on the ball. And the fact of the matter is, that was a tragic earthquake and tsunami, killed 18,000 people, but that wasn't from the nuclear. They just recorded their first nuclear fatality in 2018. Nobody died in 3 Mile Island. 57 people died out of Chernobyl, and maybe, as Bill Nye said, maybe up to 4,000 over life. We are trying to save the planet. Now, I'm all for going against corruption whenever and wherever you can find it. Is there arrogance? Yes. Is there sclerotic thinking? Yes. Go after it. But please don't sacrifice the planet in the process, because we need carbon-free energy.
There's some mythology in what you've just said. There's quite a bit of mythology in what you've just said. We account for the waste and contain the waste. You tell that to the Navajo people of this country, where the uranium was mined. There are more than 200 million tons of uranium mine waste, a large part of them in Navajo country, and still not remediated. They still don't have clean water, and they still live in radon-contaminated houses, many of them. There are more than 200 million tons of milled tailings, which have thorium-230, which is a waste byproduct of uranium, which goes into the fuel. There's 20 tons of waste at the reactor, but behind every ton of waste, there's hundreds or even thousands of tons of uranium mining and milling waste, both of which are radioactive. And we import most of the fuel, so we're damaging other countries as well.
So what is the bottom line on that horror that you describe in relation to the question before us? Are you saying that that is endemic, it's unavoidable, it's going to be repeated, that that's just the way the business is always going to be?
Well, uranium mining is unavoidable in the uranium business. If you want nuclear fuel, you have to do uranium mining.
I want to take it to this.
Or you have to separate plutonium.
Or
Very quickly,
Kirsty,
very quickly.
Well,
Can I just
please.
Okay. If you took all of the waste generated from the beginning of the U.S. commercial nuclear industry, it would fill one football field 10 yards deep. That's it. From coal, it would reach up to the space station. You take all the nuclear waste that would satisfy your energy requirements for your lifetime, it would fit in a soda can. So we have to put this in the context of the scale. We know how to contain it. We've seen geologic formations that have done it. The Finns have figured out how to do it. The Swedes ended up with 2 communities competing for the opportunity to host a repository. This is a solvable problem.
Can I
Facts don't
offer
penetrate.
to
Well, I just say the original question had to do, I think, with accents and with the nuclear industry. And I think one of the things you have to keep in mind is that if we do dramatically increase the amount of nuclear power plants we have in the world, we will increase the frequency of accidents. So accident frequency, because they are a largely unavoidable scenario. So we will get to a point in which, if we're dramatically increasing reactors, we're talking about accidents maybe happening every year, every 2 years, every 5 years. Now, all of those accidents may not require significant health effects, but they are going to affect the industry, they're going to affect the energy generation, and all we have to do is look to what happened in Japan. After the accident in Japan, Japan shut down its entire nuclear fleet because they had to do safety checks on those reactors. And what happened is they turned to fossil fuels and their emissions went up. So their solution was to dramatic increases in energy efficiency and a build down of solar power in about 5 years where they dramatically increase that. So now they have replaced that nuclear generation with efficiency, conservation, and solar. And in fact, their emissions are now back down to lower than they were before their nuclear program had its catastrophic accident. And to put it in perspective, the cost of that accident is pegged at several $100 billion. Several $100 billion.
right, let me let
we
the
don't
other-
have the time and the
Let
money.
me let the
for
other
that.
side have a. I might not be able to get to your question depending on how long Kirsty takes.
Okay, so 2 sentences. So Fukushima showed that nuclear going wrong is better than coal going right. And the World Health Organization reports, which I've read in detail around the Chernobyl and the Fukushima accidents, have told us that the by far greatest public health impact caused by both of those accidents was fear of radiation, not radiation itself. And that is all to do with how we responded.
Do you have a question that you can put in 1 sentence now?
Yes. You mentioned that what we need to do is make it cheap, right? That's the problem. So my
Uh-oh.
question is it possible to make it cheap? In a very few amount of sentences, how? And if it's not possible, why?
Okay, that was great.
Okay, can I?
Well done.
Man,
There's a whole new generation coming along, and they are going to build reactors that are standardized in design. One of the reasons why these reactors have gone so far over cost and over schedule is because they're stick-built. They don't finish designing the reactor before they start building it. There's common sense things that can and should be done. I was responsible for project management. We can have contracts that align the interests of the contractor with the interests of the ratepayer, which we have not had. We can have smaller factory-built modules that, as is happening in the LNG industry, will be then shipped to the site, standardized sites, so you're not doing a different bespoke design every single time. We just got to do things smarter, better, and cheaper, and I, again, refuse to believe that we don't have the ingenuity to do it.
other side.
I mean, the industry told me that 10 years ago. They told me that 15 years ago. They told me that 20 years ago. So it's a common talking point that the next generation of reactors is going to be better. The reactors, specifically in the United States, were promised to be better. They failed dramatically. So, again, it's a unicorn.
Let me answer.
I'm sorry, Arjun, I've got to wrap it up.
Why can't
I'm sorry,
you make
I'm
nuclear
sorry,
power cheap?
I'm sorry. That concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where our resolution is, it's time to expand nuclear power. Let's begin round 3. Round 3 are closing statements by each debater in turn. They will be 2 minutes each. They will stand again at the lectern for this and making his closing statement for the resolution. Please welcome again Dan Poneman, former Deputy Secretary of Energy.
Thank you, John, and thank you to our esteemed opponents, our lively debate. On November 14th, 1938, President Roosevelt convened a meeting at the White House, and he was briefed on the impending threat from Nazi Germany. Now remember, FDR grew up as a boy, loving the sea, loving sailing, building model ships. He became Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Wilson. He had communicated with Alfred Thayer Mann on the superiority of naval power and what could be done strategically for our country with naval power alone. And yet that day, facing an existential threat of a rather different character, he authorized a massive expansion, something they said could not be done, of American air power. In 1939, we produced 3,000 airplanes. By 1945, we had produced 300,000 airplanes and won World War II. Now, conceivably, FDR could have said, you know what, I don't think so. I think Admiral Mann was right. We can do this with sea power alone. And maybe we could have won World War II without that air power. What do you think? Maybe, maybe not. But he decided to go for it. And the question he had to ask is, did he want to risk the answer to an existential threat on the hope and the prayer that his preferred strategic outcome would be achieved with naval power alone? He did not. I think we're in an existential moment today. And the question is, are we going to leave the most prodigious source of carbon-free energy known to humanity outside of the realm of what we're going to try? It may work, it may not work. I think we have no choice but to throw everything we can at the climate problem, including nuclear. And that's why I ask you for your vote that now is the time to expand nuclear power.
Thank you, Dan Poneman. That is the resolution, and here to make his closing statement against the resolution, here is Arjun Makhijani, President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research.
I'm going to answer your question. The reason you can't make nuclear cheap is because in an electric power plant, the nuclear reactor is only the boiler. 80–90% of the costs are downstream. And the nuclear boiler is much more expensive than the coal boiler by design. Okay, now, let me tell you a story. How did nuclear power start as an idea that might be cheap and economical? It started with the Atoms for Peace speech. It is a fig leaf on the horror of the thermonuclear bomb. President Eisenhower didn't want to make a gloom and doom speech, and he said, "Give me something good to say," and they gave him Atoms for Peace. After that, there was a propaganda campaign, and Commissioner Murray called it propaganda at that time. That resulted in the greatest business managerial disaster in history that I've told you about. That was round one, fool me once. Then we had the nuclear renaissance. It's all streamlined. We have standardized design. AP1000 will build them large like cookie cutters, standardized, streamlined licensing procedures. Last time we had all this, inspections and re-inspections. Now we'll do it right. Fool me twice. Now we've got this mass manufacturing, standard, small modular reactors. Let me tell you, the small modular reactors that's being certified, it has a steam generator inside the reactor, which will be very much more radioactive than the steam generators we have today, which is the most frequently replaced expensive component of pressurized water reactors. In fact, they've been replaced in all of them. Fool me thrice. Now, if you want to be in the fool me thrice school, expensive and doesn't work too well and takes too long, sitting at the edge of the climate precipice, please vote for them. Otherwise, vote for me.
Thank you, Arjun Makhijani. The resolution is it's time to expand nuclear power. Here making her closing statement against the resolution, Kirsty Gogan, co-founder and executive director of Energy for Humanity.
Thank you. So the vast majority of nuclear plants that are being built today, they're being built on time and they're being built on budget and they're very cost competitive with fossil fuels and with renewable energy. And when we did this study looking at new build projects around the world for the British government, we looked back at the United States experience. And you know what was really surprising and interesting to find was that you guys have done it before as well, and you've actually achieved an average cost which is equivalent to the best costs being achieved in the rest of the world today. And you know how you did that? You did it through a programmatic approach by building up skills and experience and capability within the supply chain, within the labor force, within the regulator, within the project leadership team to deliver good projects. So you've done it before. Now, the anti-nuclear movement was created at a time when climate change just wasn't really understood as an existential threat. And if it wasn't for climate change, yes, we should just burn gas. But now is the time to reevaluate what we think of as the risks of nuclear energy in light of the real and present dangers presented to us by climate change, by air pollution, that threaten the lives of millions of people materially every single year. And we just cannot base our climate mitigation strategies on poor people remaining poor, because it's not realistic, it's not ethical, and you know what? It's not our decision. Condemning women to spend 35 hours a week collecting firewood to cook food, which will then kill her and her children through respiratory illness, isn't an energy strategy, it's a humanitarian disaster. But you know what? This creates an untenable gap, a gap between what the science tells us is needed and the reality of what's happening in the world. Because yes, we're successfully driving down the costs of renewable energy, and yes, we're building wind and solar, but carbon emissions are not coming down. Now, the deadlock is breaking. The Union of Concerned Scientists have changed their minds. And if you think that there's a chance that what I'm saying is true, then you will support the amendment, the motion to expand nuclear energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirsty Gogan. And our final speaker will be speaking against the resolution. Please welcome to the lectern Gregory Jaczko, former chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
I'm convinced. I think they've presented a wonderful argument. It's just not true. So, we can talk about these very impassioned pleas about women not burning things. That's not what we're talking about here. We can solve that problem of that woman with a solar solution today. I don't need a debate. I don't need an NGO to make that argument. That's what's happening in the real world. The solutions that we need to deal with the climate crisis are in front of us. They're cheap, they're available, but they're not nuclear. It doesn't matter what we decide today, what anyone decides today about whether we should give nuclear a new opportunity, a new look. It cannot compete in the marketplace. It cannot provide the kind of power we need in the future. And it has all these ancillary issues about safety, which we haven't really touched on, but which are there. So these are wonderful, impassioned statements that, like I said, always make me think, my gosh, am I thinking the wrong thing? And then I go out and I see what's happening in the real world. And we certainly aren't building enough of what we need to build. But we're certainly right now today building far more renewables than we are building nuclear. And we're not building anywhere close to what we need with nuclear, and we can't build anywhere close to what we need with nuclear. So we can say that we're going to give nuclear a chance and then it's time for nuclear, and it doesn't matter. Our hope rests with the things that can work today, not with the things that we promise are going to get better tomorrow, because they've been promising for 15 years that they're going to get better tomorrow. And they haven't. And yet, while we're talking about this, renewables have quietly become so cheap that they can work everywhere. And they can be deployed in rapid numbers. And in fact, I'll just close on this. We hear a lot about the wind not blowing and the sun not shining. The sun comes up every day. It only doesn't shine during an eclipse. And how many solar eclipses do you remember in your life? Solar works on a cloudy day. It's still sunny. So if you think that we can solve the world's problem with nuclear, then God help us, because we're not going to get there. So vote for our solution.
Thank you, Gregory Jaczko. And that concludes closing statements in our Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. And now it's time to learn which side you feel has argued the best. We want to have you again go to your phones to place your second and final vote. Okay, while you're doing that, first thing I want to say that this was a very passionate debate, and it was somewhat technical as well, but I felt that all four of you helped us understand the technical side of it, that you were very, very accessible, and that was really, really useful to all of us. And also, it's clear that you feel very passionately about this, all four of you, but as I said at the beginning, our goal is to get people to think, but to respect the fact that there are valid opinions, there are valid arguments on the other side, whether you agree with them or not. They're reasonable, they're respectable. And you all showed that respect to each other, so you met our goal and our target. So I want to thank you for the way that you all argued here today. So thank you. While we're waiting for the vote, sometimes when we have a little bit of time, and I see a certain dynamic among the debaters, I'd like to just probe into it a little bit. And what I saw was there was so much common ground that you both have the end mission in sight of zero carbons and a solution to it. Some of you have undergone, you especially, Kirsty, talked about undergoing a conversion, switching sides. I'm just curious, as you listen to the arguments tonight, is there something that you heard from the other side that's not part of your argument, but that you think your side really should listen to and take seriously? That they actually do have a point? And I'll start with you, Greg. By the way, no is an okay answer. This doesn't have to be a kumbaya moment. But
yeah, no, I mean, it is, the point, I mean, it is that we shouldn't take anything off the table. I mean, that's true. We absolutely shouldn't. I mean, I think at the end of the day, nuclear is not going to deliver, but we shouldn't take it off the table. I think in that regard.
Right. Which wasn't but the resolution wasn't take it off the table.
Right,
It was
exactly.
don't
Yeah.
expand it.
Yeah.
Kirsty, what do you
Well,
think
you
on
know,
that?
I kind of started this evening saying that I really hoped that actually my goal was for us all to achieve some consensus. And I feel like that's happened, which is kind of was my wild ambition. So thank you.
All right.
Well,
Arjun?
I actually changed my mind 14 years ago when my mentor, David Freeman, who's the father of energy policy in this country, wonderful man in his 90s, he said we should get rid of coal and oil and go to solar. This was 14 years ago when solar was $10 a watt. And I said, you're going to send every industry into bankruptcy or to China. We can't afford that. And he said, I won't use the expletive, but he said, don't be a naysayer. You haven't studied the energy issue for quite some time. I worked for him in the 70s. So do it. And I did. And I surprised myself by concluding that it was possible to have a carbon-free and nuclear-free economy in the United States that would still be economical. At that time, it appeared to be extremely difficult with very ambitious R&D, but 10 years later, it appeared to be a slam dunk.
Where's the part
And
where
that's
you...
where. Well, I didn't change my mind as a result of this debate because I changed my mind previously as a result of
All right,
another
fair
debate.
enough. Dan?
It's a tough one. I would say, to a first order, I will identify the space in which I think what you asked for, John, could happen. That is to say, I think all of us were surprised at the level of consensus on the objective, okay? I don't think anybody here disputes that that first 10, 20, even 30% can be cheaply and wonderfully achieved through renewables. The open question, and it is an analytical question, is when it comes to these challenges, such as the transmission, such as the intermittency, such as the backup power, and what it is, could we, if we went off in a room somewhere and have, proper analytics behind us, come to closer convergence on what that thing looks like? I mean, that would be the one place. I wouldn't say we'd achieved it now, but that would be the open question in my mind that I think would be worth exploring.
But it couldn't be a smoke-filled room because that would be CO2. So none of that.
We got too much of that.
I have the final results. You have voted twice on the resolution. It's time to expand nuclear power. Once before you heard the arguments, and again after you heard the arguments. We're going to give victory to the team whose numbers have changed the most between the first and the second votes. Here are the results. On the first vote, 49% of you agreed with the resolution that it's time to expand nuclear power. 21% disagreed. 30% were undecided. On the second vote, 47% agreed with the for side. They lost 2 percentage points. The team arguing against the motion, their first vote was 21%, their second vote was 42%. They picked up 21 percentage points. The team arguing against the resolution, it's time to expand nuclear power, named our winners. Our congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time.